We've made good progress through 1936 so far, and we've met some new players in this fledgling comic book industry. We're about to meet another and talk about a mystery that no one has ever been able to solve. We've already established that the comic book industry was not exclusive to New York, but it was exclusive to New England, at least until March 1936. The Comics Magazine Company ambitiously planned to beat the others by branching out. Its editorial office was in New York, but it also had a Chicago office to handle Midwest distribution. Why Chicago? We don't know exactly. Probably the publishers had some Chicago connection. Maybe they found cheaper printers there, or they knew they had advertisers lined up who were from Chicago. Early issues did include ads from the Curtis Candy Company, based out of Chicago, that made the hugely popular Baby Ruth and Butterfinger candy bars. Finding a cheap printer was almost surely on their agenda because they did everything cheap. Not only did they not print entire issues in color, just like National Allied comic books, but when they did use color separation, it could look terrible. Like it would have been better to just go full black and white terrible than this terrible. So, who are these Comics Magazine people and why were they so confident? It was formed by William Cook and John Mahan. Cook and Mahan had been the managing editor and business manager, respectfully, of National Allied, working there for just 3 months before they quit and founded their own company. And as for why they were so confident, it might have been because they had Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Theirs is one of the first features in the book. In 2 pages, we're introduced to a wraith like giant terrorizing the city of New York, Cleveland, I don't know. And we're introduced to Dr. Mystic, who grows in size and matches the giant's state of corporealness so that they can wrestle. The giant is actually his old friend Zator, who did this to draw Dr. Mystic out because Facebook doesn't exist yet. There's an emergency in India that needs their attention, so they both drop into the spirit world, which is kind of like hyperspace and lets them move really fast. But they're stopped by a villain named Koth who gives them the join me or die ultimatum. Now, this gets strange quickly because this character both is and isn't Dr. Occult, a character they were already doing for National Allied. He looks like Dr. Occult, although to be fair, Joe Shuster drew most of his leading men almost identical to each other. I haven't spent a lot of time on Dr. Occult so far, so to catch up, Dr. Occult and his partner, Rose Psychic, who we barely ever see, stopped a vampire from attacking a couple called the Amsters, but this was no ordinary vampire because silver bullets couldn't stop it. This was only the start. The Vampire Master was soon terrorizing the whole city with vampires and issued a personal challenge to Dr. Occult. Occult was lured into a trap by Mrs. Amster, who was abducted and hypnotized by the Vampire Master. The Vampire Master turned out to be a mad scientist with a machine called the Thought Materializer that creates solid constructs from whatever the user imagines. You'd think this guy would just make millions patenting this thing, but Mrs. Amster saved the day when she overcame her hypnosis and stabbed the Vampire Master to death. In the same month as Dr. Mystic encountering Zator and Koth, Dr. Occult stopped the Methuselah Killer, a madman who thinks he can live to 1,000 years old if he kills people and adds their remaining lifespans to his own. But he just thinks this will happen. He's not shown to be a spellcaster who will make this happen by performing some kind of mystic ritual. And I've already mentioned that the vampires weren't supernatural but turned out to be science fiction. More telling is that at no time does Dr. Occult ever show any magical abilities except for using a magic symbol that seemed to work on the first vampire. If he did have Dr. Mystic's powers, then he could have just entered the spirit world and reappeared on the other side of the Vampire Master's trap. So this seems to definitively prove that there's no way Dr. Mystic and Dr. Occult are the same character. Until 7 months later, when Dr. Occult's next adventure picks up right where Dr. Mystic left off, in the spirit world, next to Zator, confronted by Koth. Dr. Occult now has Dr. Mystic's powers just for how long it takes to defeat Koth, and then the features goes back to ignoring all that, and Dr. Occult is a low-powered occult detective with more of a science fiction-y bent once again. So what was that all about? Before I get to that, let me add that this was not the only crossover with National Allied. Far from it. Also appearing in the Comics magazine Borrowed from National Allied's second title, new comics are Chico Chaco, a racist feature about Mexicans, Dickie Duck, a kinda Donald Duck clone, Freddie Bell, He Means Well. Freddie's a little boy who gets into hijinks. This and Dickie Duck were both by the same creator, Matt Curzon. Captain Bill of the Rangers, which you may recall is actually about the kids Johnny and Jane. Sheldon Mayer's The Strange Adventures of Mr. Weed, a very original strip we've talked about before about time travel and romance played for comedy. And J. Worthington Blimp, another Mayer title. This one is a Joe Palooka clone. And John Patterson's Skipper Hicks, name changed here to Skipper Ham Shanks. I've previously said in another episode that Skipper Ham Shanks was the first feature to permanently move from one company to another. It's actually a four-way tie between that, Matt's Dickie Duck and Freddie Bell, and Bill Allison's Captain Bill, soon more accurately renamed The Further Adventures of Jane and Johnny. But Skipper Ham Shanks is the only one of those I like, so I'm going to talk about that. I called it Popeye like before, but that is very reductionist, and I want to spend a little bit more time describing it. In More Fun, it was the skipper's pal Soup Ladle Jones, who is the character who most closely physically resembles Popeye, except his face, which looks more like Wimpy, and he's a con man like Wimpy, only more criminal because Jones passes himself off as a medical doctor and Wimpy just tries to scam people out of hamburger money. We don't ever actually meet much of the crew, but you would think a steamer the size of the Marianne would need a substantial crew and the rest must just always be off panel. We also meet Sponge Nose Kelly, an old friend who recruits them for their first adventure. Their first adventure is trying to reach Gillyfish Isle, surrounded by giant whirlpools that is rumored to be rich with silver, gold, and diamonds. Their ship gets through the whirlpools in just a single panel. The island is inhabited by at least 20 people who are the children of the island's original colonizers who landed over a century ago before the whirlpool sprang up. The inhabitants have long since stopped valuing diamonds, which they instead use to pave their streets, and have taken to basing their economy on the rarest substance on the island, pop bottles. When John Patterson moved over to the Comics magazine, he decided to begin again with almost the exact same story, but changing the names of all the characters. Skipper Hicks becomes Ham Shanks, which is surely meant to remind us of Ham Gravy, the one-time main character of Thumble Theater. Soup Ladle Jones becomes Poss Fash, an even odder name. Sponge Nose Kelly becomes Spike Kelly. This time, instead of making the treasure so easily found, it's sunk in a ship off the coast of an island run by a villain, Sultan Sourpuss, instead of eccentrics. Although Hamshanks claims to be tough and that he's licked 20 men in a fight before, we don't ever actually see him being all that tough. In fact, their strongman is quickly recruited from Sourpuss's employment, an ogre-like fellow named Corky. Although most of these features will permanently move over to the Comics magazine, soon renamed Funny Pages, Dr. Mystic and Sheldon Mayer's features vanished after just one issue. So now, what happened? And that is the mystery that no one has ever been able to definitively solve. Here are the possibilities. Case number 1. Cook and Mahon commissioned additional material from 6 creators or creative teams with Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson's blessings. This is possible. Malcolm seems to have been a generous boss. We know he was generous with promotions to editor. In this case, he displays incredible generosity, not just letting them use his freelancers, but letting them borrow intellectual property that belongs to him. Granted, no one was protecting their IP that closely back then. I've talked before about how common plagiarism was because there just wasn't enough money in any of this to make court cases worthwhile. What casts doubt on this case is how everyone goes back to National Allied, exclusive at different times. Mayer just after the first issue, and Siegel and Schuster after the first 2. In the second issue, Siegel and Schuster debuted their next creation, a strip called just Spy, starring Bart Regan. I'm not going to talk long about it now, but we will definitely come back to talk about it when Spy reappears, not in the next issue of Comics magazine, but back at National Allied in the first issue of Detective Comics. which is coming, don't worry. It seems less credible that Malcolm would be okay with a new strip debuting while on loan. Case number 2. There was no blessing. Cook and Mahon stole strips from Wheeler Nicholson. In this scenario, Malcolm is sitting on some emergency fill-in strips and he hasn't needed yet, and this would not be unusual. Later, DC and Marvel would both sit on deep piles of emergency fill-in material. Maybe Cook and Mahon had solicited some material on their own. Comics Magazine #1 featured 16 short features with no earlier publication at National Allied, but they knew this material wasn't good. Some of it, like the minstrel comedy Pork Chops and Gravy, is also extremely racist and offensive. Don't worry, I'm not going to show you that one. The best of the not-so-good new material was Tom Cooper's 2-issue short story feature Black Lagoon about deep-sea diving. Tom Cooper was a slightly above-average artist who created Captain Spinnaker and Buckskin Jim for National Allied. So the theory is they only stole a few features that they thought would give them more of a solid launch, or maybe all of these features were in a slush pile and they stole all of them. Black Lagoon itself might have been something Tom had submitted to Malcolm that Malcolm was just sitting on for now. But the weakness of this theory is this. Why would Siegel and Schuster and Patterson have changed the names of their characters before their work was stolen? I do think I've already made a good case, though, that Dr. Mystic was intended to be a new character and was only later retconned into being Dr. Occult. Also, Patterson may have started over because he realized he had written himself into a corner. Skipper Hicks and crew had become rich too quickly and too easily. But there is a third case to be made. Case number 3. It wasn't theft, it was conspiracy. I have pointed out a few times already that National Allied wasn't doing well. At this point, they still can't afford to print in all color. Perhaps a lot of the creators begin to wonder how long there will be money for paychecks, too. Cook and Mahon make a case to them that they have serious financial backing. The joint offices in New York and Chicago certainly makes it look like they do, and that they should jump ship and come with them. Some of the now 8 co-conspirators leave Malcolm enough of a backlog of their strips that the two companies will be able to run their features concurrently for a few months, but they have all been secretly prepping material on the side for Cook and Mahon. Sheldon Mayer is the first to see through their story about financing. He knows how comics are made. He takes one look at the color separation on issue 1, and he knows they were full of it. The funny thing is, Sheldon doesn't even go back to National after this. He jumps ship and heads to Dell. The other creators, all or most of the other creators, all figure it out more slowly. Or Malcolm contacts them and says, "Get back here or you're never welcome back at National." Siegel and Schuster, they have too many ongoing titles at National to risk that, so they bail. John Patterson and the others will stick with the Comics Magazine company, with John staying through the Comics Magazine's next 2 owners for the rest of his career in comic books, which lasts only until 1939. The weakness of this case is that, well, Malcolm has to be a really great boss to have no misgivings over this. Not only does he allow Siegel and Schuster to come back, but he agrees to continue publishing Spy for them and lets them create 2 more features for him, the second of which will wind up being Superman. Can you imagine what Superman would have been like had the Comics Magazine published it instead? I can, and I think I'll make a separate video or episode about that someday. But I've gone on long enough for this episode. I wonder which of the 3 cases you'll find most convincing. Let me know in the comments section below, right after you like and subscribe to this channel. And bye for now.